Himself up as a paragon of virtue and vowing to keep up his harsh criticism of President Trump, saying he'll speak out until integrity returns to the White House.
Here to react, former deputy assistant to the president at Fox News, national security analyst Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Doctor, always good to have you here. Sounds like Dr. Brennan is going to be speaking out for a long time.
Well, until he's probably charged with being at the center of Spygate. And this is a man who has done something no other former CIA director has ever done. Nobody has attacked a sitting president the way John Brennan does, in a way that undermines the integrity of the current government. He's actually feeding in to Russian propaganda and supporting people like Vladimir Putin with what he states, which shouldn't surprise anybody because John Brennan has actually admitted, and this is the shocking thing, that at the height of the Cold War in 1976, he voted for Gus Hall, the Communist Party candidate for American president. That's when the Soviet Union was trying to destroy America. This man has a track record which clearly is unpatriotic and un-American.
Doctor, maybe I'm naive, but I thought CIA directors of either party, you know, whether it was somebody nominated by President Bush or somebody nominated by President Carter, that they were supposed to be nonpartisan.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Ed. On his Twitter feed, it actually says under his bio, non-partisan or neutral individual. This guy's a political hack, and as the good bard Shakespeare said, the lady doth protest too much. He is making so much noise because he knows that he is at the center of Spygate. Remember that Australian ambassador? You remember how it all began, how they sent operatives overseas to talk to him? That only happens with John Brennan's approval. So the whole dossier leads back to John Brennan, and that's why he's being so loud now.
So when you say doth protest too much, do you think that John Brennan has become sort of unhinged because he's worried this investigation is turning on him?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We now know that this was an interagency operation. It included the CIA, the FBI, DNI. Clapper is trying to cover, but he's perjuring himself as well. But at the center of all of this is John Brennan, and that's why he's being so loud now. And John Brennan doesn't launch a political attack using the intelligence community against Donald Trump without President Obama's approval. So this is why the man is unhinged,
Well,
Ed.
quickly, what about the morale and the decency of the agency that he ran? I mean, to Ed's point, saying at one point he was nonpartisan or still claims to be, you've got 35,000 or more working at the FBI, thousands that work at the CIA. They don't ask which president they serve. They just serve the country. What does this do when you have people that led these places now speaking out so politically, basically putting their political opinions, their personal opinions against the president?
It does the same thing that Jim Comey has done to the FBI. One man manages to undermine the prestige of tens of thousands of others. Don't forget, not only was this man a former communist, John Brennan, when he came into the CIA, he never should have been let in with that track record. He wanted to be an operator. He wanted to be a case officer. He failed abysmally, became an analyst. And so when Obama made him the director of the CIA, he took his revenge and he tried to make analysts run operations. It was a disaster. Thank the good Lord, Mike Pompeo took over and has saved the CIA, and now he's doing an amazing job as Secretary of State. So he's damaged the prestige, but we're getting it back.
All right. Brennan's not going anywhere.
Yeah, Dr. Gorka, we appreciate you coming in.
Good to see
Thanks,
you.
Ed. Thanks, Abby.
Daniel Hoffman, former CIA station chief who served as chief of station in Moscow and elsewhere, also a Fox News contributor. Daniel, always good to see you.
You too.
A big surprise this week when Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, Putin's right-hand man when it comes to foreign affairs, made a surprise visit to Pyongyang, really laid some flowers and wreaths at some monumental sites and had some high-level meetings. What do you make of Lavrov suddenly going off to Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, we've been accustomed to talking about Russian meddling in our elections, and now we're seeing Russian meddling in our efforts to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. Lavrov hadn't been to Pyongyang in almost a decade, and what's noteworthy about his visit, it was entirely public. He didn't apparently have any private meetings. This was for the public to consume, and it was definitely a message to North Korea's leadership. He had public meetings with Kim Jong-un, as well as a message to the United States. His focus was on sanctions, and he talked about ratcheting down the sanctions before North Korea takes the action that we deem necessary to eliminate their nuclear weapons arsenal.
What is in Russia's interest, and what did Lavrov, do you think, say to Kim Jong-un during those meetings?
Well, I think first it's worth remembering that North Korea is an old Soviet satellite state. In fact, the first leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, was a major in the Soviet Red Army and fought against the Japanese during World War II. The Soviets installed him as the leader, the first leader of North Korea. That's not taught in North Korean history books for their students, but it's a true fact. The Russians absolutely want to play a role in the diplomacy in the region. First and foremost, they want to counter the United States strategically. They're very concerned about the United States' influence in the region, both militarily and politically. They'd like to reduce our military presence and our influence. So I think that's part of the reason why they support Kim Jong-un. It's a legacy from the Soviet days. They also support Kim Jong-un because they frankly don't like sanctions to which they've been subjected, and rightly so, for invading Ukraine and interfering in elections in Western Europe and the United States. They also see a lot of political and potential economic benefit from resisting those sanctions. They believe that if our relationship with Kim Jong-un and North Korea does pan out, they want to be there and to take advantage of increased trade. They're already violating the sanctions with some export of oil and allowing North Korean guest workers to reside and work inside Russia, but I see that they'd like to do a lot more economically with North Korea.
So they want a piece of the pie, and as you're right, at the UN they've been saying that the Russians have been busting those sanctions with the oil tankers transporting oil that has been embargoed against Pyongyang, that they've been doing the end run around, evading the sanctions that they have basically voted for the Security Council.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's a balancing act for them. They know they need to do a little bit, and I think, frankly, President Trump's show of strength concerned them. They were nervous about the potential for hostilities between the United States and our allies and North Korea, and so they did take some action with sanctions, but you're absolutely right. They have been busting them a little bit. There's a port city, Nakhodka, which has been the site of some export of Russian goods to North Korea, and Vladivostok is only about 60 miles from the North Korean border. That's Russia's strategic port.
So the president wasn't really thrilled. Lavrov suddenly popped up during all this. Here's what the president had to say about that the other day.
I didn't like the Russian meeting yesterday. I said, what's the purpose of that? But it could be a positive meeting. If it's a positive meeting, I love it. If it's a negative meeting, I'm not happy. And it could very well be a positive meeting.
While they're discussing a possible Putin-Trump presidential summit, what do you think the president should say and now do in light of Lavrov's visit?
Well, first, I think the president would keep in mind, I'm sure he'll be keeping in mind the failures of the previous administration. The Obama administration believed that Russia was on our side in Syria. And when the Russians said, when Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov told Secretary Kerry that there was no military solution in Syria, Lavrov was lying about that. Russia imposed a military solution on behalf of Assad. And so we know that Russia doesn't have our best interests at heart in the Korean Peninsula, and I think the president knows that. I think Secretary Pompeo will be a great consigliere to him, as will our new director of CIA, Gina Haspel, who is a subject matter expert on Russia. I think key right now will be our intelligence community furnishing the president with the intelligence he needs so that he'll be in the know about what Russia and Putin's real plans and intentions are in the Korean Peninsula. But I think the best leverage that we've got against North Korea is by pushing this bilateral relationship that we enjoy right now with the North Koreans.
Now, looking past the Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un, the White House officials now confirming to Fox News that they are in the early stages of planning a potential face-to-face sit-down between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. This, of course, comes amid Special Counsel Robert Mueller's ongoing investigation into the Russian influence and interference in the 2016 presidential election, a topic that would certainly come up if both these world leaders sit down together. So what can we expect if this does come off, this summit does occur? Well, Dr. Rebecca Grant is a national security and military analyst and also president of IRIS Independent Research. So, Dr. Grant, you've got a Twitter photo on your Twitter, which is fascinating. It shows Gorbachev and Reagan meeting for the first time, I guess, in 1985. And you write in it that there was lots of shouting. Can you tell us about that? Because it's kind of enticing to think of President Trump. I mean, he is a New Yorker. He's a guy from Queens. He is blunt. He is direct. He is very frank. He's going to take no guff, from Putin. I think he would sit right directly and tell him what he thinks.
and he can be very smooth. So what happened with Reagan and Gorbachev in Geneva was, Gorbachev wanted to talk about Star Wars. Reagan wanted to talk about human rights. It went on over 2 days, and there were shouting matches that occurred. And one would say, oh, I rant and rave and get up. But in the end, the two leaders set the path towards another 3 summits and some wonderful arms control treaties. So a summit is a good thing.
I would worry if they were shouting, but I guess it turned out okay. But in this day and age, you've got Syria. You've got Russian support of Assad, of course, the invasion of Ukraine. You've got the election interference that the intelligence community certainly said happened. All these actions, as well as Russian meddling throughout the world, Sergei Lavrov going off to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Jong-un to try to gum up the works in this potential summit. So what does change, if anything, in terms of Russian behavior?
Well, let's roll it back. So Trump mentioned in March that he was open to a summit with Putin. And, Putin is in a tough spot. His economy is very weak. It's smaller GDP than California's. He's been very militarily aggressive. So there are a number of things that Putin and Trump should talk about. Syria is top of the list. Also the situation in Ukraine. And let's not forget, Eric, that Russia has some very, very nasty cyber capabilities. The FBI warned us just this week to turn off our routers because of a Russian-linked Fancy Bear hacking group. So there are a number of things that Russia is doing to destabilize everything from the cyberspace to nuclear weapons development. They have a lot to talk about, and that's why I'd be in favor of seeing them sit down and talk at some point in the future.
Well, would talking, would that deter Putin's objectives and the actions that the Russians are taking at our expense?
I wouldn't expect one discussion to fix anything, but I can understand why Trump would want to meet personally with Putin in a one-on-one format. They've had a couple of smaller meetings and really see where the potential is. Listen, at some point they are going to have to talk about the outcome in Syria. There's no getting around that. And we've seen some hints from the Russian side that they may want to talk a little bit about arms control at some point in the future, as amazing as that sounds. So the agenda is so big that I think it would be very appropriate. I wouldn't expect this to change Russian behavior immediately, but, we have to keep up that strong military deterrent and then see what outcome we can look for.
And what would you see in terms of Syria? I mean, Assad's not going anywhere.
Right, exactly. But the fact is that we cannot withdraw coalition forces from Syria really until we see some diminishing of Russian and Iranian activity in that sphere. We have to talk with Russia on a frequent basis about deconflicting our forces. Don't forget that our air forces face the Russians almost every day. We'll see Russian jets trying to maneuver around our air forces, and our air forces usually lock them up, okay? But that's something that we have to look at. So there has to be some discussion. There are plenty of issues with Syria to discuss. And then ultimately, we need to see Russia, as George Kennan said, contained. They're going to behave badly. We need to contain them.
And we apparently struck out and killed a bunch of Russian contractors a few weeks ago when there was an alleged attack on one of our bases. Finally, you mentioned Fancy Bear. Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, authorities say, or GRU intelligence services that actually hacked into our election system. They hacked into the Illinois election system during the 2016 presidential election. Here's what the Wall Street Journal says about that and the Russian interference. Quote, a meeting that would bring to the international stage one of the world's most enigmatic political relationships. Meeting Mr. Putin last year on the sidelines of the G20 summit meeting in Germany, Mr. Trump voiced concerns about Russian interference in the election. Then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said at the time, Mr. Putin, during a 2-hour meeting that lasted twice as long as planned, denied any involvement. So, what do you do when Putin's sitting right next to you and he goes, well, we didn't do anything. That's not us. It's all, propaganda and, how does it stop?
Isn't that typical KGB, GRU behavior? But the fact is that we know that Russia is making a strong play to dominate and attack in cyberspace, just as they are with other forms of military electronic warfare that we see in Syria, Ukraine, and other places. So this is one of the big issues. It's like the arms control of the 1980s. Now cyberspace and behavior in cyberspace has to be part of that very contentious discussion.
The arms control of the 1980s perfectly, said Dr. Rebecca Grant. Thank you, as always.
Thank you.
Of course.